I think we have to recognize just how much this trend it's been kind of increasing exponentially, like this kind of undermining of any rules-based order. And because either you're going to try to arrest that trend and restore some basic norms and try to revitalize democracy, or you're kind of accepting there's this kind of part of the world that's the US and Europe and a handful of other countries that all agrees to play by certain rules. And then most of the world, because, most of the people in the world live in other places, it's this kind of authoritarian future in which people don't have any regard for norms. And I think it's worth the effort, at least, to try to see if you can prevent that from happening.
So, Ben, let's talk about the book. And there actually is a natural tie-in from the story of Belarus diverting this airplane, because they did it because of a dissident and young dissident and journalist on the plane. It struck me that this is someone who you might have interviewed and talked to for the book that you wrote. And I wanted to ask you, you traveled around the world talking to civil society activists and human rights advocates, and you began your story in Hungary.
Yeah.
Tell us why you began it in Hungary, and tell us just a little bit about what you were trying to do with this book.
I began in Hungary because I had this sense when I was spit out of the Obama administration after the 2016 election, right, of why is everything going in the wrong direction, in terms of American democracy, but, globally, this kind of acute sense of this building authoritarian and nationalist trend. And I felt that I could see it more clearly when I got out of the United States. It's kind of like being in a dysfunctional family or something, Dan, and you need to go talk to someone else to understand what's happening
I
at
wouldn't
home.
know anything about that.
Neither would I, of course. So I was sitting with this Hungarian anti-corruption activist, and we were actually, ironically, in the old headquarters of the East German government in Berlin. And I said to him, well, how did you guys go from being a democracy to basically being a one-party autocracy in a decade? And he said, that's it's a simple story. There was a right-wing populist backlash to the financial crisis in 2008 that ended up propelling Viktor Orban into office. He redrew the parliamentary districts to favor his party. He changed the voting laws to make it easier for some of his supporters to vote, harder for others. He packed the courts with right-wing judges. He enriched a bunch of cronies who then kind of financed his politics. Then they bought up the media and created a kind of right-wing propaganda machine. And then they wrapped this whole thing up in a kind of nationalist bow of us versus them. And us is the real Hungarians, the true Hungarians, and them is immigrants, or it's George Soros, or it's liberal elites, or it's Muslims. And he's talking, and I'm thinking, is he describing America? Is he describing what I've experienced the last decade?
I was going to say,
he could
sounding eerily familiar.
Yeah, and so then I figured out what a fascinating opportunity for someone who was, in the White House to go out and talk to people who, or lived the issues that I worked on and worried about, and Alexei Navalny in Russia, or these young activists in Hungary and young people getting into politics there, or Hong Kong protesters. And through their eyes, I realized I could see better what's happening, not just around the world, but in America too.
You go beyond saying that the United States was experiencing the same kinds of, kind of descent into authoritarianism or nationalism as other countries. That there was this kind of global trend. You actually make the case that the United States was driving it in some real sense with our policies, our kind of overcharged capitalism, the financial crisis, post 9/11, military adventures, Iraq, all of that. So that is something that I think is going to be somewhat controversial.
Yeah.
And you of course were there when the Republicans were charging Obama with going on an apology tour in the early days of the Obama administration. So what is your response to the criticism on that is going to come? Or make your case for it, I guess, first.
I'll make the case, yeah. I mean, I guess I didn't set out to write that. I set out to kind of write this book about why is authoritarianism taking root. And everywhere I went, I kind of began to detect some of the fingerprints of 30 years of American dominance in the world. First of all, the starting point, I guess I'll start with the rebuttal, which is we've been the dominant power in the world for 30 years. And we went from 1990 to 2020. how are we not somehow responsible? Like, we've been, much more powerful than anybody else, and this is the outcome of it. I guess what I'd shorthanded this way, Dan, because there's a Hungary version of the story, a Russia version of the story, and a China version of the story. But I'll go to China and just say, I guess, the most provocative version of this thesis, which is that, I had this really unsettling experience I read about in the book where I was kind of woken up in my hotel room by some Chinese officials who wanted to meet with me. I'm not even in the U.S. government anymore. And they were asking me or telling me that Barack Obama should not meet with the Dalai Lama in India, which was our next stop on a trip that we were on in 2017. And what was unsettling about that is not that message. I've gotten that message before. It's that we hadn't announced a meeting with the Dalai Lama. So they were just like, unsubtly, they're either my email or the Dalai Lama's, or both. And I walked outside and I looked at the Shanghai skyline, which looks like the future. I mean, it's this kind of beautiful, futuristic, lights everywhere, people taking selfies. And on the one hand, you see this prosperity and you're like, what an achievement of the Chinese government and of the US-led order that allowed all these people to be lifted out of poverty. But then the more I thought about it, I was like, the Chinese Communist Party can feel very different from anything that's familiar to us politically. But if you take kind of the last 30 years of kind of unbridled capitalism and the post 9/11 kind of hyper focus on national security as a kind of foundational concept of national identity, and American technology platforms that created a lot of hope for empowering people, but became these kind of perfect tools for disinformation campaigns in the Russian case, or in the Chinese case, as I experienced, surveillance, kind of total surveillance of a society. If you take those elements and just strip out the democracy from it, it is the logical endpoint of what our interests have been the last 30 years, and I don't say it's to provoke or criticize, because I also think a lot of good in the world has come from that period. A lot of people lifted out of poverty, a lot of human ingenuity, a lot of creation has happened. So I'm not like a hard leftist who sees any American hand as bad. In fact, I actually think America is essential, because if we get out of the game, it's just Putin and Xi, right? But I do think we have to reckon with, we as a society came to prioritize these other things more than democracy, making money, national security, the kind of endless expansion of technology, unregulated also. Can we really honestly say to ourselves, Dan, that we cared more about democracy than those things these last 3 decades? And if you're going to tell me that the answer is yes, we care more about democracy, I was putting the final touches on this book when January 6th happened. And there's a whole major political party in this country that clearly could care less about democracy.
Well, the irony, of course, is that a lot of it, at least during the Bush years, was done under the guise of spreading democracy around the world, ending tyranny.
Well, but Dan, that's part of the problem, because that was so cynical. I mean, we invaded and occupied Iraq, something, I write about in this book, like we never recovered from that internationally. I mean, it's funny, people here at home kind of moved on, and the same people who did the Iraq war kind of went on to all kinds of successes. But the rest of the world is like, these people don't know what they're doing. And then when we wrapped, after the WMD case collapsed, that was not the original justification for the Iraq war, was not spreading democracy. The original justification was, these people have weapons of mass destruction. It was only after that rationale collapsed that we had, this was a freedom agenda. Look at what's happened to freedom since the freedom agenda. Because part of what happened is the rhetoric of democracy became attached with policies like the Iraq war. And that discredited advocates for democracy around the world, because it's like, well, you're not really for democracy. You're just for some American agenda. And that's been very damaging.
Okay. So, you talk about, America's standing in the world, and you write about that quite a bit, and how the rest of the world is perceiving us. Let's take something very specific coming up this year. President Biden has decided we are going to pull out of Afghanistan by September 11th, something which I believe you support, ending the forever war. And yet, what are going to be the consequences for the United States standing in the world if after that the Taliban does takeover. It does start executing the people who have worked with us, the translators and other government officials who have been our allies. And, women are once again, stripped of all civil rights. The message to the world from that seems to me to be, something that we ought to be worried about.
No, I don't disagree with you, Mike. And I support it with a lot of mixed feelings for the things that you say. I think, though, the issue is that's been what's happening anyway with American troops there. The trend lines have been moving in the direction that you describe with American troops in the country. And so the basic point here is that there's been this kind of constant effort for 20 years. Well, first of all, I think there's just a basic common sensing of, if you go to war and 20 years later, people weren't even born when that war started or being sent there, like something has gone wrong. But I think even beyond that, there's been this search for some formula that would arrest these negative trends in Afghanistan, when I don't think 2,500 American troops or 5,000 American troops, they've been there through no fault of their own, by the way. This is the direction things have been going in. And at a certain point, I think our hyper focus on this project of the war on terrorism, which has consumed trillions of dollars. And when I was in government, the bandwidth, the attention of senior officials. I mean, I was in more meetings probably about, Yemen and Somalia than China when I was in government. That's not rational, given the state of the world. So at some point, I think you have to decide if there really are these kind of existential challenges out there to democracy itself, and I think from climate change as well. You've got to reallocate your time and attention and resources. It doesn't mean that there's not a human tragedy or even a cost to U.S. credibility about what happens next in Afghanistan. But I think that on the other side of that coin, I don't know why keeping those troops there would prevent the continued degradation of conditions there. And I'd like to see us do anything we can to mitigate it diplomatically. I'd like to see us open up the door to any Afghan that worked with us to come here. But I think that that's the reality that we're dealing with.
I want to kind of step back to the big picture that you were talking about, which are the three three drivers of the kind of the illiberal trends that we're seeing globally and also in the United States. The economy-driven inequality, the social media and disinformation cycles and technology platforms that seem to be kind of driving us down hyper-divisive paths, and then finally kind of the negative impact of the war on terror and its continuing grip on kind of domestic and international policy. I was struggling at the end of your book to figure out whether or not I was inclined to just kind of crawl under my desk in a depressive stupor, or whether or not they were actually sort of like, bright spots, that changes happening in these three drivers.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious, when you finished the book, right around the time January 6th was happening, where were you? Did you want to kind of get under the covers and just sort of hide for the next few years? Or do you feel like that these drivers are beginning to change, that there's movement?
Well, what I think is, I ended on something of a hopeful note. First of all, because the experience of kind of looking really squarely at where things have gone wrong kind of makes you feel more activated for what should be. The hope I have is twofold. One, people don't want to live like this. I mean, we hear all about the attractiveness of the Chinese model. It's created all this prosperity. There is one place in the world where people literally had the option, maybe two if you count Taiwan, literally have the option to opt in to the Chinese model. It was Hong Kong. And the entire city did not want to do that. I mean, the Hong Kong protest movement that I can immerse myself in was kind of evidence of the reality that no, people really do prefer democracy, and you see that I experienced that in Hungary too, and the Russians I talked to. Now there's an imbalance of power in Hong Kong, so they couldn't kind of fend off this encroaching influence of the Chinese Communist Party. But I think people everywhere, ultimately want to believe in the better story that human beings don't have to descend into kind of a nationalist, which by the way is the norm in history. It's not new. Like most of history is a story of nationalism and wars, not a story of democracy and equality. The hopefulness is like, think of where the debates are on these issues today versus where they were a decade ago. in this country, the awareness of the challenges and problems with, say, social media and technology platforms, or the awareness of inequality being kind of corrosive to a society, and that's evident in the Biden agenda, or the awareness that the kind of national security focus of the post 9/11 wars, it didn't turn out the way we wanted. There's a much more evolved understanding of this, and therefore space